She thought distance would protect her. She thought going quiet would be enough to make it stop. The wanting, the warmth, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. But Russell Prescott didn't disappear when she pulled back. He just waited. And waiting, from a man like him, was more dangerous than anything he could have said. If you're new here, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get back into the story. The week that followed was the quietest kind of difficult. No confrontation, no dramatic silence, just the low, persistent hum of two people existing in the same space with something unresolved between them. Ruby came in every morning, did her job with the same steady competence she always had, and managed to be professionally warm with everyone, including Russell, without giving him anything beyond that. She was good at it. She had years of practice keeping her interior life separate from her exterior presentation, and she deployed that skill now with the focused discipline of someone who understood that the alternative was considerably more painful. What she hadn't accounted for was that Russell was equally good at patience. He didn't push. He didn't linger at the desk longer than was operationally reasonable. He didn't text again after that last exchange, which she had read at least a dozen times without responding to beyond that single admission, "I know," that she still wasn't sure she should have sent. He gave her space with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and somehow that was harder to manage than pressure would have been. Pressure she could have pushed back against. This she just had to sit with. Diane, to her eternal credit, said nothing for 4 full days. On the 5th day, she set a cup of coffee on Ruby's side of the desk. The good kind, from the cafe 2 doors down, not the break room machine, and said simply, "You look like you haven't slept." Ruby wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'm fine." Diane looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to know exactly what fine meant when someone said it that way. She didn't push. She just went back to her computer. But the coffee was there, and that was enough. Ruby visited her mother on Saturday. Carol Sutton was having a better week. Up earlier, moving with less difficulty, complaining about the physical therapist with renewed vigor that Ruby privately found reassuring. They ate lunch together at the small kitchen table, and her mother talked about a neighbor's renovation and a television show she'd gotten invested in. And Ruby listened and laughed in the right places, and felt, underneath it all, the particular ache of wanting to tell someone something and not knowing how to start. Her mother noticed, because her mother always noticed, and waited until Ruby was washing the dishes to say, without looking up from the newspaper she was pretending to read, "Something's on your mind." Ruby kept her eyes on the sink. "Just work stuff." Carol turned a page. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. And Ruby was grateful for it, even as she felt the things she wasn't saying sit heavier in her chest. On the subway home, she finally admitted to herself, in the unsparing way that only late Sunday afternoons allow, that she wasn't pulling back because of the rumor. The rumor had been the trigger, not the cause. The cause was simpler and more frightening. She was in this. Fully, inconveniently, with no remaining emotional distance to retreat to. And the gap between her life and his, the 41 floors, the different worlds, the fundamental asymmetry of what they each had to lose, hadn't disappeared because the kiss had been real. If anything, feeling it that clearly made the gap more visible, not less. She got off at her stop and walked home in the November cold and thought about his text. Tuesday night was real. And thought about her own reply, and thought about the fact that real had never actually been the question. The question was whether real was enough, whether she was enough, whether this was something that could hold the weight of 2 actual lives, or whether it was beautiful and temporary, and she was already too far in to walk away without it costing her something significant. She unlocked her apartment door and stood in the dark hallway for a moment before turning on the light. Then she took off her coat, made tea she didn't drink, and sat on her couch for a long time, thinking about a man who had chosen, very deliberately, to wait. Russell had a meeting Monday morning with his director of operations that ran 40 minutes over schedule, which meant he came through the lobby later than usual, closer to 10 than 9, and Ruby was with a guest when he walked in. He didn't stop. He noted her profile at the desk, the slight tilt of her head as she listened to whatever the guest was explaining, and kept moving. But he'd been thinking about her all weekend in the specific, unproductive way that happens when you've made a decision and are waiting for the other person to catch up to it. He'd been honest with himself about what he wanted. That was new. Russell Prescott had spent the better part of 2 decades being strategic about everything, including his own emotional life, keeping things surface level, clean, easy to exit. What he felt about Ruby wasn't any of those things, and somewhere in the past week of giving her space, he had stopped pretending it could be contained into something manageable. He wanted her in his life. Not as a careful Tuesday evening arrangement, actually in his life, with all the complication and asymmetry and uncertainty that involved. The question was, how to say that without it sounding like a negotiation, which was the only register he'd ever been fluent in. He found his answer unexpectedly on Monday afternoon. He was passing through the lobby at 3:30 when he overheard, not intentionally, just proximity, a fragment of conversation between 2 front desk staff near the corridor. A name, Ruby's. A tone that was light in the way that conceals something less light underneath. He didn't stop walking. He didn't react visibly. But he made a quiet internal note, and by Tuesday morning, he had spoken privately with David Park, with the kind of calm specificity that left no room for misinterpretation. He wasn't heavy-handed about it. He simply made clear that the professional environment he expected at the Prescott Grand did not include speculation about colleagues' personal lives, and that if it continued, he would consider it a management failure. David nodded with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what was being communicated. Russell thanked him and moved on. He didn't tell Ruby he'd done it. That wasn't why he'd done it. What shifted was subtler. By Wednesday, the texture of the lobby had changed in a way Ruby noticed but couldn't immediately source. The sideways glances were gone. The careful silences when she entered a room had dissolved, and Priya had been notably, almost pointedly, professional in every interaction. Ruby wasn't naive. She understood something had happened. She just didn't know what or who. She found out Thursday, indirectly, when David pulled her aside before her shift to tell her, with uncharacteristic directness, that he wanted her to know the recent gossip had been addressed at a senior level and would not be a recurring issue. Ruby thanked him, walked back to the desk, stood there for a moment with her hand resting on the counter and something moving slowly through her chest that she couldn't immediately name. He hadn't told her, hadn't used it, hadn't made it something she owed him. He had just handled it, quietly, completely, without making it about himself. Ruby looked across the lobby toward the elevators and thought about a man who paid attention to things she never asked him to notice, and felt the last careful argument she'd been constructing against him begin, very quietly, to come apart. She texted him Thursday evening. Nothing elaborate, just, "Thank you for what you did." She stared at it for a moment after sending, then set her phone face down and went to make dinner she wasn't particularly hungry for. His reply came 20 minutes later. "You don't have to thank me." She picked up the phone, typed, "I know. I wanted to." There was a pause, long enough that she'd moved to the couch and pulled a blanket over her legs before the next message came through. "Can I see you this week?" Ruby read it twice. Outside, the November wind was pressing against the windows with that particular persistence that made her apartment feel smaller and warmer than it actually was. She typed, "Yes," put the phone down, picked it back up, added, "Not the hotel." His response was immediate this time. "Wherever you want." They met Friday evening at a small wine bar in Astoria. Her neighborhood, her choice, her territory. It was a deliberate decision on her part, and she suspected he understood that. The place was unpretentious and warm, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and a bartender who knew her by name. Russell arrived exactly on time, which she'd expected, wearing dark jeans and a charcoal sweater instead of his usual work clothes, which she hadn't expected, and which did something entirely unhelpful to her composure. He looked different outside his professional context. Not smaller, never smaller, but more present somehow. More like a person and less like a position. He looked around the bar with genuine curiosity rather than assessment. And when the bartender greeted Ruby with easy familiarity, he watched the exchange with something that might have been quiet pleasure. "You come here a lot," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "It's my neighborhood," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I let you pick." The word "let" landed with a small warmth that she filed away without commenting on. They talked for a long time. The earlier conversations had been good, honest, real. But this was different because the careful, professional scaffolding was entirely gone now. There was nothing left to hide behind, and neither of them tried. Russell told her about his father's death 3 years ago, a fact he delivered quietly, without drama, but with the particular weight of someone who still thought about it daily. His father had never seen any of it. Not the first hotel, not the expansion, not any of it. Would he have understood it? Ruby asked. Russell considered that with the seriousness it deserved. "He would have worried about whether I was happy," he said, "which is a different question." Ruby looked at him across the small table. "Are you?" He held her gaze. "Getting there," he said. Not a deflection, an actual answer. She felt it land. When they left the bar, the street outside was cold and quiet, and they walked without a fixed destination, the way they had that first night in the park, their arms occasionally brushing, neither of them moving away when it happened. At the corner of her block, Ruby stopped and turned to face him, and he was already looking at her, hands in his pockets, waiting. Not pushing, just present. She reached up and touched his jaw with her palm, unhurried, deliberate, the way he had touched her face in that lamplight weeks ago. He went very still. His eyes on hers were unguarded in a way she was still getting used to. "I'm not good at this," she said quietly. "Neither am I," he said. "We're doing fine," she said. And then she kissed him first, for the first time, standing on a sidewalk in Astoria with the wind in her hair and his hands coming up to hold her like she was something he'd been careful with for a long time and intended to keep being careful with. It lasted a long moment. When she pulled back, his forehead dropped to hers, and she heard him exhale. Slow, quiet, like something releasing. And she closed her eyes and thought that getting there sounded exactly right. The 2 weeks that followed were the closest thing to ordinary that either of them had experienced in a long time, which, given the circumstances, was extraordinary in itself. They fell into a rhythm that felt less like something constructed and more like something discovered, the way you find a path through a place you've been walking through carefully for months and realize it was there all along. Russell came through the lobby in the mornings, and they exchanged the kind of look that contains an entire conversation. They texted in the evenings. Nothing constant, nothing performed, just the natural back and forth of two people who had become genuinely interested in the details of each other's days. He told her about a difficult acquisition negotiation in Boston. She told him about a guest who had left a handwritten thank you note at the desk, which almost never happened anymore. He asked follow-up questions. She noticed that he always asked follow-up questions. They saw each other twice that week outside of work. Once for dinner in the West Village again, once for a Sunday afternoon walk through Riverside Park that had started as an hour and turned into 3. The city was fully into November now, the trees stripped back, and the light going gold and low by 4 o'clock. And they walked with their hands occasionally finding each other, and their conversation moving easily between serious and light, in the way it did when two people have stopped performing for each other. Russell bought coffee from a cart near the park entrance and handed her one without asking how she took it. Black, 1 sugar. And she looked at him with an expression she didn't bother hiding. "You paid attention," she said. "I pay attention to everything about you," he said, simply, like it was just a fact he was reporting. Ruby looked away at the river and smiled at the middle distance and said nothing. Because some things didn't need a response, so much as a moment to sit in. What was also true, and what Ruby was sitting with more honestly now, was that the gap she'd been so afraid of hadn't disappeared. It had just become something she was choosing to step across, rather than retreat from. Russell's world was still a different country from hers, in ways that occasionally surfaced. The restaurant he suggested for dinner, where the tasting menu cost what she made in a week. The casual reference to flying to London for a meeting the following month, like it was a commute. The way certain spaces opened for him as a matter of course, that she'd had to work years to even access professionally. She didn't resent it. She was just clear-eyed about it, in the way she was clear-eyed about most things. And she had decided that clear-eyed was better than either pretending it didn't exist or letting it become a wall. Russell, for his part, was navigating his own version of the same terrain. He was aware, more than Ruby probably knew, of how different their lives were structurally. And he was aware that awareness wasn't the same as understanding. He'd been thinking about what it actually meant to be in something real with someone, not theoretically but practically, in the daily texture of two lives that didn't automatically fit together. He'd never done it before. Not really. Every relationship he'd had before had been comfortable, precisely because it hadn't required him to change the shape of anything. This was different. Ruby was different. And on the Sunday afternoon when she laughed at something he said, and the sound of it moved through him like light through a window, he thought about his father asking whether he was happy, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like he had an answer worth giving. That evening, standing outside her building in the early dark, he kissed her slowly and held her face in both hands, and she leaned into him with her whole weight, just briefly, and he took it without flinching. Like he'd been waiting to be trusted with exactly that. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 40 minutes before Ruby's shift started. She was on the subway, standing, one hand on the overhead bar, when her phone buzzed with her mother's number. Carol Sutton did not call before 9 unless something was wrong. Ruby picked up immediately. Her mother's voice was calm, deliberately calm, the kind of calm that costs something, and told her that she'd had a fall the night before. Nothing serious, no new fractures, but the overnight pain had been significant enough that the home care agency was recommending a short-term rehabilitation stay at a facility in Flushing. Just 2 weeks, maybe 3, covered partially by insurance. The gap, her mother mentioned with careful casualness, was about $1,400. Ruby said all the right things. She'd handle it. It was fine. She'd come by after her shift. And hung up and stood in the moving subway car with the city blurring past the windows, and did the math in her head with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing that math for months. It was manageable. Barely and uncomfortably, but manageable. She was not going to fall apart on the Q train at 8 in the morning. She straightened her shoulders and watched the stations pass, and arrived at work 4 minutes before her shift, looking exactly like herself. She almost held it together completely. Almost. It was Diane, inevitably, who noticed. Not because Ruby showed anything visible, but because Diane had been watching Ruby for 2.5 years and knew the specific quality of stillness that meant something was being actively contained. She didn't say anything until mid-morning, when the lobby had quieted and Ruby was between tasks and staring at her screen with the focused blankness of someone not actually reading what was in front of her. Diane set a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Just a second, just contact," and said quietly, "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone, you know." Ruby pressed her lips together, nodded once. Didn't trust herself to say anything more than, "I know." Diane went back to her work. The hand on her shoulder had lasted 1 second, and undone considerably more than that. Russell noticed something was different the moment he came through the lobby at 9:30. He'd developed, over months of paying close attention, a reliable sense of Ruby's internal weather. And today something was off in a way that had nothing to do with him or them. He stopped at the desk with a routine question about a guest preference, and while she answered him clearly and professionally, he looked at her face with the specific attention he reserved for things that mattered, and saw it. The controlled quality around her eyes, the slight tension at her jaw, the way she was holding herself just a fraction more carefully than usual. He didn't ask in the lobby. He texted her at noon. "You okay?" She replied 20 minutes later. "Family stuff. I'm fine." He looked at that for a moment, typed, "I'm here if you want to talk tonight." Then he put his phone away and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back calls, and tried, with incomplete success, not to think about what family stuff meant, and whether she was somewhere carrying something heavy entirely alone, which he suspected she was, because that was what Ruby did, and because the thought of it sat in him like something he wanted very much to fix, and wasn't sure yet he'd been given permission to. She texted him at 7, "Can I come over?" He replied in under 10 seconds, "I'll be here." She arrived at his apartment at 7:30, with her coat still damp from the light rain that had started on her walk from the subway. Her hair slightly loose from the wind, and the particular look of someone who had been holding something together all day, and was only now, in a safe enough place, allowing the edges of it to show. Russell opened the door and took one look at her and stepped aside without a word. And that, the simple, unquestioning stepping aside, was what finally broke through the last of her composure. She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier, hadn't been since she was a teenager, and decided somewhere along the way that tears cost too much when you needed your energy for everything else. But her breath caught once, audibly, and Russell put his hand on her back and guided her to the couch and sat beside her, and waited with the patient, unhurried quality that she had come to understand was one of the most important things about him. She told him everything. Not just the call that morning, all of it. The months of quiet financial management, the shift rearrangements, the careful math she did in her head on the subway, the way she had become so practiced at making everything look fine that she'd almost convinced herself it was. She talked for a long time, and he listened without interrupting, without offering solutions before she'd finished, without making her feel like a problem to be managed. When she was done, the apartment was quiet, and the rain was audible against the windows, and she felt, underneath the exhaustion, something that took her a moment to identify. Relief. The particular relief of being fully known by someone and not having them flinch. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You didn't have to," he said, "but I'm glad you did." She looked at him. "I'm not good at letting people in." "I know," he said. "I'm not either." A small silence. "We're doing fine," he said, Her own words returned to her quietly, and she felt them land with a warmth that moved all the way through her. She laughed once, soft and real. "We really are," she said. Russell reached over and tucked her hair back from her face, with the same unhurried certainty he'd had that first night in the park. And this time, she turned toward him fully, without hesitation, without the careful internal negotiation that used to precede every moment of closeness. He looked at her the way he had that very first time in the lobby, that expression she'd spent weeks trying to categorize, and now she knew what it was. It was recognition. The look of someone who had found something they hadn't known they were looking for. "I don't want to do this carefully anymore," he said. His voice was low and certain. "I want to actually be in this, with you, whatever that looks like." Ruby held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the rain had steadied into something gentle and continuous, and the city below was all amber and wet light. And she thought about the girl who had stood behind that front desk for 2.5 years, expecting nothing, and somehow, improbably, been found anyway. "Then be in it," she said. He kissed her slowly, with both hands framing her face, and she leaned into him with her whole weight, the way she had outside her building, fully, without reservation. And he held her like he meant to keep her, which he did, which she finally, completely believed. The rain kept falling. Neither of them pulled away. And in the warm quiet of that apartment 41 floors above the city, two people who had spent years being alone in different ways chose, at exactly the same moment, not to be anymore. If this story moved you even a little, drop your rating in the comments, 1 to 10, and let us know. And thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with Russell and Ruby. It means everything to have you here.